Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of TIME100 Talks. I'm correspondent Ashley C. Ford, and boy, do we have a great show for you today. Nearly 60 years after the historic 1963 Civil Rights March on Washington, thousands of people are expected to gather together at the same time, at the same location, for the upcoming Get Your Knee Off Our Necks Commitment March. This march comes as we continue to witness the killings of Black bodies by the police, causing nationwide protests against police brutality and racial injustices. Similar to ongoing peaceful protests happening across the country since the killing of George Floyd, this march will reiterate the demands for police reform, criminal justice reform, and racial equality. Here to discuss what our current movement toward equality looks like is singer, producer, and entrepreneur Pharrell Williams, who partnered with Time to curate our cover package, The New American Revolution. He'll exclusively speak about the piece he published, America's Past and Present Are Racist. We Deserve a Black Future. We also have activist and Black Lives Matter co-founder Opal Tometi, who will be speaking with Time's Lisa Villa about how Black Lives Matter has evolved in recent months and years. Reverend Al Sharpton will be in conversation with Time's Mia Trams. He will talk about how this march came about and what we can expect. St. Paul, Minnesota Mayor Melvin Carter will join today's show, and I'll be speaking with him about how his city is responding to the national conversation regarding race and police reform. And finally, we have Congresswoman Karen Bass of California. She'll be speaking with Time's Molly Ball about the importance of the upcoming march and participating in this year's election. Before we get started with the show, I want to thank American Family Insurance for making today's important conversations possible. Here's a special message from American Family Insurance's VP of Marketing, Sharina Smith.
In 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered one of the most iconic speeches in history. He shared his dream for equality and painted a vision of what our nation could be. And while our country has made some strides in racial and social progress, we still have work to do. At American Family Insurance, our mission is to inspire, protect, and restore dreams, because we believe your dream is the most powerful thing you'll ever own. Through our partnership with Time, we'll continue to support and encourage fearless dreamers, because dreamers change the world.
Thank you so much, Sharina. We've got a lot to get to, so let's get started. Now, as you all know, we're living in a Zoom world, and unfortunately, Wi-Fi issues happen. So as much as we'd all love to see him, we're at least thankful that we can hear him. Singer, producer, and entrepreneur Pharrell is joining us by phone. Welcome to the show, Pharrell.
Good morning.
So the first thing I wanted to ask is just what inspired you to curate and participate in the New American Revolution project? Why did you want to make that happen?
You know, we all have to, if we love our country and we love ourselves as a people, as a community, we all have to participate as much as we can. As they say, where I come from, you get in where you fit in. When I look back at all the things that have happened in our nation, good, bad, or indifferent, there are things that are just missing. All of us collectively couldn't lay out the systemic issues. There's so many, but if we got to start somewhere, and the New American Revolution is essentially looking at what the American Revolution was supposed to be in the very beginning, right? Like, the founding fathers were essential founders. They were founders of companies. They were entrepreneurs. They decided that they didn't want to pay taxes to the British monarchy anymore because they had no representation in British Parliament. So it was basically no taxation without representation. And that's the same thing going on over here, right? We don't have the representation. We don't have proportionate access to education, proportionate access to healthcare, and proportionate access to representation, and not just in legislation, but just civil issues. We just don't have enough representation. And if you think about it, lobbying that happens on Capitol Hill is mainly for groups, organizations, and companies. And how many companies do we own? I mean, yes, we are around 13.7% of the population of African Americans and African diaspora, but we really don't have a piece of the pie. You know, that song for the Jeffersons, it's like we finally got our piece of the pie, but where is our slice?
How does Black art play into your vision of a Black future?
Well, I want to be very clear that the future is for everybody. Mm-hmm. And when I make reference to Black, I'm speaking about the fact that, you know, if 95% of the observable universe is dark energy or dark matter, which actually what allows us to see the light, why should we as a race ever feel inferior if we are deemed Black? That's first and foremost. And when you talk about the universe, you know, when we look out into space at night, right, we see the stars. You know, science tells us that we're looking at the past, we're looking at the present, and we're looking at the future all at once. So for me, that's very important too, because it just shows us that, like, we have nothing to fear, you know, and the people who fear us have nothing to fear. I mean, just look up at the sky at night. It looks like us all the time, literally, no pun intended. Before you get to Black art, art is the expression and it is the co-creation with the creator. You know, every time we think something, we are co-creating. Every time we draw something, we are co-creating with the creator, right? The creator created not only everything that's on this planet organically and inorganic, but it created all the other planets in our solar system, which, by the way, you know, our planet, as heavy as these topics are in the world right now, like our planet, you know, rotates at 1,000 miles per hour. As heavy as all this stuff is, and as heavy as everything else is altogether, you know, our planet travels 55,000 miles per hour around the sun and our solar system. Mm-hmm. So my whole thing is like, what can't our God do? What can't the universe do for us? When you think about like people expressing themselves, you know, they're sometimes it's a time capsule to tell you what was going on. Sometimes it's just like literally just like, you know, it's the future. I mean, I'd even argue that like artists are psychics, right? Because they see something in their head that no one else sees, and then they literally just sort of translate, right? So Black art is the art that comes from the Black progressive minds, you know, and people who are seeing things that's going on. So they create, paint, design these time capsules, or people who see the future. Black art is very important during these times. Black art is American art. America was built on the back of our ancestors. All of my ancestors were enslaved, all of them. I did the show with Dr. Henry Louis Gates. What he's doing is bringing people together by letting them know that our countries are interconnected, because America, you know, American culture is Black culture. These are stolen lands built by swollen hands. It's just time that we just look at this, man. I love this country. And I know you're not asking me this question, but I might as well say it, man. I love this country, man. But we got to just look at what it really is and how it was built. There's nothing Thanksgiving about the Trail of Tears. You know, that was actually Thanksgiving. And we just got to start to look at these things, you know, as a nation. We love this country, but we just want this country to have laws that really reflect that it loves us.
So much of what you're talking about is seeing and then building, as far as I can tell. And I think that one of the things that I really loved about your participation in the New American Revolution Project were the people who you decided to bring in, or the voices that you decided to amplify in your participation. People like Janiyah Khan, people like Amari Jones, Nicholas Smith, who is an amazing artist, 21 Savage. How did you choose these people? How did you decide that these were the people who really had something to say and you really wanted to be part of amplifying their voices?
Well, I am a galvanizer. I'm not an educator. And so what I try to do is put together a group to help me curate and figure out who were the who are the emerging voices that may not be getting the volume and the visibility that they deserve. And we collectively made that decision. This was the New American Revolution issue of Time, was really honestly done by a bunch of people. It should have been a bunch of people whose names that should have gone down, not just mine. My best work is when I collaborate. You know, if you see me in the video standing next to somebody, that's what I'm really good at. Well, I'm really not good at being on the front lines. Like, that's just not my thing, you know, but I just tried to be supportive as we could. And just like I said, give visibility and volume to people who are really in it and really doing it right now, just so that like the public, so we can debunk these fears. I mean, can you imagine the kind of fear that we've seen, you know, over the past couple of days, just being pushed to the American people? Like Doc Rivers is correct, man. Like, all cultures have their issues, but man, we're the ones that are afraid. We're the ones that are being shot and killed, you know, unarmed. Like, this is really happening to us. This has always happened to us. Right. You know, the internet, good, bad, or indifferent, and its ubiquitous nature is exactly the reason why that, you know, people are talking about it more, because other than that, you read it in a textbook, which was whitewashed in a way that like was tolerable. Well, when was it tolerable? I mean, 13th Amendment should just said, you know, slavery is abolished. Why did it have to have except? It's really real. It hurts when people can't see it. But you know what? I've always said it, man. A fish doesn't know that it's wet. Until you wake up and realize that you're in something and a part of something, and that you have a natural born privilege to you, given to you when you're not a person of color in this country, you might not feel it. You might not see it. You might not hear it. You know, some people look at that photo of all those men on Eric Garner as a black man resisting arrest, while we see a man who's saying he can't breathe.
You know, activist Janiyah Khan, who's part of this issue, says that we have to make revolution irresistible. What makes revolution irresistible to you?
Empathy.
Talk to me about that a little.
Empathy, and it is the number one, it is the biggest deficit in this country. You talk about like deficit and, you know, in the stock market, that it pales in comparison. The lowest low of the stock market has never compared to the deficit of empathy in our nation, because we are people who look at others who look different than us. We wrap ourselves in the assurance of like stereotypes that are not always true. I think the term is survival mode. We go into survival mode and we just think about ourselves. Well, that's not my problem. Well, I don't know those people, or it has nothing to do with me, or I had nothing to do with it. But there's an inherited responsibility and privilege that is given to our white brothers and sisters. The minute that you're born non-melanated, you're just given this free pass. You know, you don't get red line like we do. Now, I'll say that some of our poor white brothers and sisters get some of this treatment, but it's not something that they can't get themselves up out of. It's very different. You see, there's an oil and water culture out there in our country where they say, we get it, we're different, and they are them and we are us. But if you hear that, that's sides. There's no blending of oil and water. There's oil and water in business. There's oil and water in legislation. There's oil and water in healthcare. There's oil and water in education. That's the oil and water culture. It looks like it's all good until you read the fine print. That's fine print racism. My state was one of the first 13 colonies, but think about that, colonies, colonialism. You know what I'm saying? And people confuse colonialism with capitalism.
Yes.
But colonialism is toxic capitalism.
Talk to me a little bit about capitalism in terms of, you know, I know that you guys just came out with this amazing song, Entrepreneur, and the video includes so many Black, brown, like just different kinds of entrepreneurs, like people who, and specifically Black, but people who are not necessarily famous, but are running businesses and doing this work. How important do you think entrepreneurship is to getting to the places we want to be in the United States?
I know we have a very long way to go. The video highlighted there are people out there. We want them to get support. They are out there. At the same time, that we just need our nation to recognize the fact that like there's been like these purposeful blockages and disadvantages levied our way. That makes it very tough for people of color to start a business. The other thing too is that, as I said earlier, like the founding fathers, they call them that for a reason. They're founders. They were founders of their company. They were founders of their concepts and ideas. And this was supposed to be, you know, a situation where all men are created equal, right? But if all men are created equal, and this law was supposed to uphold that, then laws that pertain to like, you know, all these other, you know, pillars that are systemic issues for us, like education, healthcare, and legislation, and even entrepreneurship, these things need to change. So while we highlighted a lot of the progression and what we're meant to do, we also want to bring to the light that there's a lot of changes that we need. There's so much more work to do.
And there's an upcoming march on Washington that'll mark the 57th anniversary of that 1963 March on Washington. So many of the reasons that people marched then are still reasons that they're marching today. How much more do we need to do? Like, when you think about that, when you think about like how much more could we possibly need to do, what does that move you to do? What does that move you to create?
You know, there's so many things that need to happen. We need the marches, but then we need art. We need it in our food, because believe it or not, like if we continue to eat the poison that is marketed to us, there's a lot of poison that's being marketed to us. We need it in our healthcare. We need more doctors. We need more family practices. We need more associations and organizations as it pertains to health. We need more music. We need more architects. We need more architecture. We need more representation in local municipalities. We need more business owners in the world of like ride sharing, or it's just like actual, you know, transportational companies. There's just a lot, like we just need more. We need more representation in the field. It's just very important. And the march is one way that we've seen it be very effective, but we need more. We need more. You know, if they expect more out of the citizens, you got to stop treating us like a consumer base. We got to act more like a country, not like a company, but we act like a company, and we treat our citizens like a consumer base. But you know what? If you look at the plight of the Black man and the Black woman and the Black human being, it's not dissimilar from the other minorities and the other people of color. If we would just ask ourselves, when these municipalities and these states look at us and, you know, while we're protesting and not pay attention to the fact that they're infiltrators and imposters in some of our groups, trying to like malign, if you will, and blaming us, when all we're trying to do is stand up for what's right and protest, like you said, march. Maybe some of these municipalities and states should look at themselves and ask themselves what their core values are. And you know what? If you really want to know what a city's core value is, all you got to do is look at its city seal. What would be very interesting if we just did a diagnostic and just asked ourselves, what are on our city seals? What is a true representation of our core values as a city? As people start to point fingers, you know, as cities start to point fingers at the kids that are out in the streets just trying to stand up for what they believe in, why don't they just take a look in the mirror and look at their city seals? In my Virginia Beach city seal says, the city of Virginia Beach, landmarks of our nation's beginnings. Well, what do you think of when you hear that? What are the landmarks of our nation's beginnings? When we took the land from our Native American brothers and sisters, right? Or how the Blacks got to Virginia in the first place. When I think of our landmarks, the landmarks of our nation's beginnings. And that's just Virginia Beach. How many other city seals should we take a look at before our cities start pointing fingers at the youth who are looking at these things that are systemically not broken, but fixed. Fixed
Right.
against the progression, fixed against cultural diversity, fixed against integration, fixed against the future. It's fixed. It would be really interesting if we could just take a real good look at our city seals across our nation so we can see who we are. And then, you know what, if you read it and say, man, I disagree with it, then maybe we need to change these city seals so that they were more reflective of human rights. The city seal in my city where I come from, and I love my city and I love my state and I love my country, but I love it mostly because of its potential and some of its progression. But
yes.
I think my city seal should say the city of Virginia Beach, sanctuary for human rights. I say sanctuary because isn't that the safest place in the church? Number one. Number two, it should be a sanctuary for human rights because in my city, our city seal is in our city inspection sticker. So that's what you have in your car, you have in your place of business. But if you're a transgender person and you feel like someone is treating you funny or you're not welcome, you look at the city seal to find refuge and to welcome. But that landmarks of our nation's beginning does not reflect a welcoming space for a transgender or welcoming place for Blacks or people of color, right? So then I'd say a good, healthy litmus test or battery test to ask business owners is to say, hey, would you accept a Black dollar? The answer would be yes. Then I'd ask, would you accept a transgender dollar? Depending on who you're talking to, some of them would say yes quickly and others would hesitate, but they would know that they have to say yes. But then I asked, well, would you accept an undocumented worker's dollar? That person might pause, but you know what? You know the color's green, so they would say yes. But what if that company or business or place of business no longer had access to the Black dollar, or no longer had access to the transgender dollar, or no longer had access to the undocumented worker's dollar? Then that business owner would have to ask itself, could that business purely survive and sustain in the market from dollars that come from a demographic that only thinks like that business owner? More than likely, the answer would be no. So what I'm saying is it's a case for better business, for us to be considerate of human rights. Let's put blue and red to the side. Let's put our politics to the side, and let's start operating not only in my city, but my state and my country like we want to make money, because that's all this has ever been anyways, about money and opportunity. America's the land of what? Money and opportunity. But we got to start acting like it. We got to make a business case for this. Put our politics aside and make a business case for the fact that not only should Virginia Beach be a sanctuary for human rights, especially if we want to do good business and be good to people, but that's what our nation should be on right now. And too often the sides in politics are just going at each other, because you know what? If you look at where they come from in their cities and their city seals, you can see what their core values have always been, not necessarily in the right place. That's my issue. That's what's got me so worked up this week.
We're less than 70 days away from the presidential election. That's coming. And we have seen divisiveness across the country, politically motivated, identity motivated, all of it. There has been a lot of divisiveness. We see it and we can't deny it. What are you hoping? What do you hope can change after this presidential election?
I'm hoping that we understand that politics have been weaponized against us. I hope we realize that we lost this cyber war. We don't even know why we hate each other as much as we do, more than we ever have. But all we got to do is just look at the internet. I'm hoping that we wake up to that. I'm hoping that we realize that we are in a civil war. There are people who want to mix ideas, mix concepts, mix cultures, and mix American energy to grow and become a dream of America that was sold to us. And then there are the oil and water group. I call them the oil and waters. It looks like we're sharing the glass, but we're not. They don't want to mix. And all you have to do is look at it in their fine print I'm hoping that we can just put these politics aside and realize there's a bigger, better, greater, greener future, not just from the point of the ecology and the health of our nation's homeostasis, but also from a business point of view. Like there's a business case, a better business if we just forget the red and the blue when it comes to human issues, things that deal with people. It needs to be like human rights. If you just put mankind in front, then you'll always do right by Black people. You'll always do right by our Native American brothers. You'll always do right by our South American brothers and sisters, who, by the way, if right now, if they all decided not to go to work for a week, our stock market would crash all over again. What's happening to our brothers and sisters at the border, our South American brothers and sisters at the border is just unconscionable. It's just beyond. Meanwhile, we say we love God, we say we love Jesus, and Jesus himself was a refugee. Or we talk crazy about our Jewish brothers and sisters, and Jesus was Jewish. Like, I just wish that we would be more realistic about the things that we say and check ourselves. I check myself all the time.
Where are you finding hope right now?
God, the universe, that the planet is still turning 1,000 miles per hour with such heavy things going on. God is the greatest.
Pharrell, thank you so much for your time. I've really, really enjoyed talking with you.
I thank you too, and be blessed, and more importantly, be a blessing. Thank you guys for this opportunity.
And we still have some insightful conversations coming your way, including our next one. Time's Lisa Villa will be speaking with activist and Black Lives Matter co-founder Opal Tometi. Lisa?
Thank you, Ashley. Hi, everyone. I'm Lisandra Villa, and I'm joined today by activist and co-founder of Black Lives Matter, Opal Tometi. Opal, thank you so much for joining us today. I've really been looking forward to our conversation, but I'm sad to have to start it with the bad news that Jacob Blake, a Black man, was shot this weekend. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what the reaction has been since then, especially after a summer that has been so full of protests and additional scrutiny at the way that Black people are treated at the hands of police.
You know, it's been very hard to witness time and time again that Black people in this country are treated with such disdain and disrespect, and our lives are ultimately, so devalued that we can see a man be shot in front of his children and almost killed. At this point, we're just thanking God that Jacob has survived. We're looking and wondering, what his quality of life will actually be. But it seems like right now that he might be paralyzed, and his children and the entire community of Kenosha, and really the world and everybody who witnessed what took place are traumatized. We're living with a level of PTSD every single time we see and hear these stories of unarmed Black people who are actually trying to do right by their families, by their communities, people who are trying to just live their lives, but having their lives be under threat from law enforcement, from vigilantes, and even sometimes from other security personnel. And what we're witnessing right now is also an uprising against the injustice that we saw take place in Wisconsin.
These are issues that I know that you have worked on for years. So I did want to talk a little bit about how you think the movement has changed between the time that it kicked off in the early 2010s and now in the wake of really George Floyd's death earlier this summer.
Yep. The movement is really one that has been longstanding and has been going on. And myself and the co-founders of Black Lives Matter, as well as people who have been involved in this incredible human rights movement, really find ourselves as part of a tradition of fighting for human rights and social justice in this country. Ever since Black people were kidnapped from Africa, brought to this land that was stolen, and there was indigenous genocide. We have always, been resisting. We've always been fighting for a world where our lives were treated with the respect and the dignity that we deserve and that we're owed. And what we're seeing now, and what even began in 2013 when we co-founded Black Lives Matter, was that Black people were ultimately being killed by the police and by vigilantes, and there was impunity, and there is and continues to be impunity. We don't see any modicum of justice being served and being afforded to Black people. And in this country that was built by Black people, we are just tired. We're ultimately fed up, and people are essentially saying enough is enough. And in 2013, when we co-founded Black Lives Matter, I'll tell you, it was a very personal project for me. I had actually just watched the film called Fruitvale Station, which is a story of Oscar Grant, a young brother who was killed on New Year's Day by Oakland Police Department. And I had just watched that film and walked out of the movie theater and got the news that George Zimmerman was acquitted for the murder of Trayvon Martin. And if folks remember, Trayvon Martin was a 17-year-old boy who was in his own neighborhood with nothing, armed with nothing but a bag of Skittles and an Arizona iced tea. And he was going home. He should have been home and with his family. He should have been able to make it there. He should be able to celebrate his birthday and holidays with his loved ones, but his life was cut short because of racist anti-Black violence that was perpetrated by the vigilante George Zimmerman. And watching that case unfold and George Zimmerman being acquitted for that murder, a murder we all know he did and should not have done, after he was also told by officials on the phone not to follow Trayvon, he was acquitted. And it broke my heart because I have two younger brothers and lots of young people in my life that I knew were going to be affected by this story and were going to feel that their lives didn't matter. And even for myself and for many of my sisters and friends and loved ones, it felt very personal to me. And I wanted to be sure that folks knew that another way was possible, that we could rise up, that we could join hands, and that we could advocate for justice for our communities. And that was, in essence, the spirit of which I joined alongside Alicia Garza and Patrisse Cullors in creating Black Lives Matter. We wanted people to be reminded of the tradition of community organizing that so many of our elders were part of. So when I look at a Martin Luther King or John Lewis or an Ella Baker, even a Malcolm X, people who were deeply connected with their communities and who empowered their communities to stand up for their rights and to assert their human dignity and to just love on each other and make sure that we're looking out for each other and compelling our allies, compelling the world to pay attention and to support us and to ensure that our human rights were no longer violated, to ensure that people stopped killing, Black people. And that is, in essence, kind of the beginnings of Black Lives Matter. And, I would also just add that what we've also been witnessing didn't just happen, in 2013. The reality is that this has been going on for decades. Black people have been killed at the hands of the police. Black people not only are being killed at the hands of police, but we're suffering in our healthcare system, in our education system. We're seeing substandard housing and beyond. And so the quality of life that we're also experiencing in this country is abysmal. And so the invitation for Black Lives Matter was, let's also think about racism in a structural way that understands that we're not just talking about, the criminal justice system or the system of policing, but we're talking about the way our society operates overall. We're talking about the power structure overall and how the power structure is such that Black lives are disempowered and Black people are being treated as if our lives don't matter. And so the invitation for BLM has always been one that's actually about transforming the entirety of our society to ensure that Black lives are respected and treated with the same level of equity that everybody is afforded in this country that doesn't look like me. Black people are treated as though our skin is a weapon or our skin is a crime, and we're fed up because it's not. Black is beautiful, Black is incredible, and we need to see the same types of respect that others are afforded in this country, afforded to Black people as well.
You just harkened back to some of the civil rights leaders, and there's a very poignant connection this week, actually, on the anniversary of the March on Washington's, the 57th anniversary of the March on Washington. And here in DC, where I am, we're expecting thousands of activists and protesters to come out to call for police reform. I want to talk to you a little bit about what's next and what are the legislative fixes that still need to happen in order to address these issues of police brutality.
Yeah. So I'm really heartened that people are coming together this weekend under this banner and this call to remind ourselves that we're part of an incredible legacy of people who have fought hard and tirelessly for justice and for human rights in this country. Coming into this weekend, we're going to be seeing people celebrating as well as affirming the need for justice right now. And so this March on Washington is happening, and people are going to be calling for the defunding of police and the reallocating of resources to supporting Black communities, to being invested in life, in justice. And what that really looks like is investing in the education system, investing in jobs, investing in a healthcare system that works. I think one of the things that we witnessed and we continue to witness throughout this pandemic is that doctors, nurses, other healthcare professionals, janitors, beyond people who really care for us, these essential workers and their essential lives were under threat because they were not funded well. They did not have the resources to support people, to keep us healthy, to keep us ultimately safe. And what we're calling for is a reimagining of safety for our people, a reimagining of safety for this entire country and for the world. And in that reimagination, it means we need resources to make that work. And so what we're calling for is, hey, we see what's happening right now. We see a militarized police force that is descending on communities and protesters around the country. And why is this police force so overly funded? Why are their budgets so bloated when these hospitals and these essential workers can't get the same type of support that they deserve? And so what we're calling for right now is, let's re-examine what safety looks like, and let's also re-examine our budgets so that they match our real values. If we believe that all lives should matter, then we need to actually resource and ensure that we have the support and the necessary ingredients to ensure that that happens. And right now, it's clear as day that that is not the case. And so what we've been calling for is really looking at safety beyond policing, looking at safety from a holistic perspective, and looking at safety from a place of dignity and real respect for everybody. We need to have a multiracial democracy that works for everybody. And in order for that to happen, we have to look at these systems that have been completely failing us, And not only are they failing us, they weren't really designed to succeed for Black lives. And we just have to be honest about that. And this is the time for that radical honesty that we deserve, because at this point, we can see it on camera, day in and day out. Even in the pandemic, Black people are being shot and killed by police, and we are just tired and fed up, and we can no longer tolerate this type of war on Black life.
Opal, you've started touching on this idea that the Black Lives Matter movement is more than just about the issue of policing, however central that may be to what you fight against. And I do want to talk about how that translates into voting rights in a year that there's so much talk and uncertainty around the administration of elections. What are you doing to encourage your supporters to ensure that their voice is heard at the ballots?
I think, to be clear, everyone must know that this year is incredibly important for the vote. Not only are we seeing the United States transforming in various ways that are negative, and that are infringing both on our rights, but also our ability to thrive and even just basically protect our families and our communities. We're seeing laws change overnight. We're seeing judges being appointed. We're seeing ways in which the right wing and nativist organizations have been infiltrating local jurisdictions, from local elected officials who are standing right alongside white nationalists, to the ways in which law enforcement has also been infiltrated by white supremacist groups. We're seeing this play out and impact every facet of our lives. And the reality is, we're also seeing the laws change to suppress voters, suppress the turnout of voters. We know that there are organizations who have been fighting to ensure that the Voting Rights Act is strengthened and protected. But I will just say that it is sad to see that this is even a conversation in this day and age, given the tremendous work of leaders like John Lewis, who recently passed, and quite literally almost gave his life to ensure these rights and that we weren't disenfranchised for the right to vote. What we're seeing now is that there are active forces to stop the vote, from changing the polling stations, to shutting some down, to gerrymandering, to attacks on the Postal Service. We know that the vote is under threat, and that means our democracy is under threat. This country is under threat from even within. And what we're doing right now is encouraging people to protect their vote, to register, to ensure that they go out, to mail in their ballots early where eligible and where they're able. And we're encouraging people who might not even be eligible to vote. So, for example, I work with a lot of immigrants, and we have undocumented people in all of our communities, brown, Black, beyond. And it's important that they too encourage people in their lives that do have the ability to vote to do that. And so we're going to make voting fun, as much as we can. We're going to ensure that people are able to stand in those lines if they need to. And we, quite honestly, don't want that to be the case. But being that there are some places that are really pushing back on mail-in voting, we're going to have to get really creative. And I hope that there will be many other elected officials and other community leaders that will stand alongside us and alongside various artists, activists, advocates, and beyond, who are calling for just real engagement around this election. We know that it's a very contentious one. We know that there's a lot at stake, and we can't afford to have this election be one that people sit out. It's sad that the United States is in a place where there are many people who have felt so, ultimately a lot of people have felt that these their voices and their votes don't matter. And so what we need to do is begin to reinvigorate a sense of faith and hope in people and their votes, and know that no matter who's in the both federal positions, but also local and state, that we hold them accountable, that we continue to push them to do what is right and what is just. And that ultimately is what we're going to continue to see, no matter what these outcomes are over the next few months. We're going to continue to push, to fight, to ensure justice. And it's what we've been doing, but we'll have to ensure that we continue to do that going forward.
I did want to ask, this is another issue that disproportionately affects people of color, which is that they make up a disproportionately large chunk of people who are incarcerated. However, there's a huge segment of that population that is eligible to vote. Is there anything that Black Lives Matter is doing to get out the vote among these jailed but eligible voters?
You know what? There are some organizations that are working on this issue right now. And I'm excited to see that there are people who are really taking seriously the fact that we do have many eligible voters who aren't being encouraged, or who haven't historically been as encouraged to vote and been systematically disenfranchised or discouraged from voting to get out the vote. And we're also encouraging our allies to do the same in their communities. We know that there are also a lot of white folks, other communities who haven't been as engaged as well. And so we're encouraging them to do the same in their communities, to encourage people of conscience to step up, be courageous, and exercise their voice and exercise their vote. It's imperative right now that everybody of conscience be out there, not only to vote, but encourage others to do the same.
What about voter intimidation? Do you worry that there might be a rise in that ahead of the November election?
There is already a great deal of voter intimidation. We've seen that people who've even accidentally voted have been arrested, have been charged, have been locked up. And this largely only impacts Black people. For example, there was a Black mom who didn't know that she was ineligible to vote after having a felony years prior, and accidentally voted, which in this day and age should not be a crime that is punishable in this way, but it is. And what we see is that people are using even these stories, as rare as they might be, of accusations of voter fraud, which just doesn't happen. The amount of voter fraud in this country is so negligible and ultimately non-existent. People aren't intentionally going out to vote. And the real fraud and the real concern here, I think, is that so many people are being taken off of the rolls. People are being told that they voted at the wrong polling station, or that they no longer are able to vote by mail, and they weren't able to vote in the primaries and they did it wrong. And so those, to me, are the types of behaviors that not only intimidate people, but they discourage people from engaging in this process. And I think this country has a responsibility, a moral duty, an ethical duty to encourage and make accessible the ability for everybody who is 18 and above to vote. And it's sad that we are in a country that makes it so difficult when there are examples of others who make it quite easy, even over the internet. Some make you automatically, and you're already enrolled, you don't have to take extra steps, but you hit a certain age and you're eligible to vote and you don't have to register. So there are ways that this country should be modern and should modernize our systems of voting. And I can't wait for the day for us to finally take our mandate seriously and implement all of the strategies to make voting as easy and seamless as possible for everybody who is eligible.
We've had a really wide-ranging conversation, but I do want to end on a note of positivity. So I do want to ask, what is it with everything going on right now that gives you hope for the future?
Oh, I love that question. What gives me hope for the future is that we are seeing this movement grow. The New York Times reported some time ago that we are the largest movement in history. And that to me is incredibly heartening because I know that this is actually a multiracial movement and it's a multi-issue movement as well. And I am heartened to see that there are so many people of conscience and of courage who have stepped up and who want to be on the right side of history. And that makes me incredibly happy, incredibly proud of everyone who is using their voice and standing up and speaking out. And I'm also really encouraged when I see young people. I see a lot of my friends' children and just, even allies or just different supporters who are showing me these videos of their kids chanting Black Lives Matter. And these kids are white and Chinese and they're from all different backgrounds. And they are getting this message that we must affirm dignity and life of Black lives. And that to me is very hopeful. And it reminds me that we can achieve what we've set out to do, and that there are a lot more people who are on our side, who are on the side of history, who are on the side of human rights and justice for all of us.
Opal, thank you so much for joining us today for this fascinating conversation. We really appreciate your time and insights.
Thanks so much for having me.
You're watching Time 100 Talks, and I'm Ashley C. Ford, Time 100 Talks correspondent. If you haven't already, follow Time on social media and use the hashtag Time100 Talks to join the conversation. Up next, we have Time's Mia Trans, who will be speaking to Reverend Al Sharpton about the upcoming Get Your Knee Off Our Next Commitment March. Mia?
Thanks, Ashley. I'm here with civil rights activist Reverend Al Sharpton. Welcome to the show, Reverend, and thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
The march you've organized with Martin Luther King III, the National Action Network, Attorney Benjamin Crump, and the families of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Eric Garner is occurring at a pivotal moment during a pandemic and just months away from our presidential election. Can you speak about the urgency of this march and what you and the organizers feel you must achieve?
The urgency is that when we were going to do the eulogy at George Floyd's funeral, I had talked to Martin a couple of days before, and I said to Martin that I think the time has come for us to go back to Washington. Obviously, his father had done the speech in 1963. He knew I was there. We were kids. I was 9 years old. He was 6 or 7. But we have done commemorations since then. 2013, he and I co-convened the big 50th month. And I said, even though this is an off year, what is going on with the country in two areas: voting, in terms of voting rights, with the Supreme Court having taken out Section 4, which was the map. And both Martin and I sat together during the oral arguments in the court that day. And what has happened with these, one right after another, cases of police brutality. We need to go back to Washington. And he says, all right, Al, you and Nan put it together. I'll co-chair it with you. And because we, National Action Network, have the infrastructure with our chapters and our offices to put it together, including our Washington bureau. When I got up to do the eulogy and started feeling the energy of the crowd, I announced it. And he teased me later saying, I didn't know you were going to announce it today. But I announced it. But right away, the National Urban League, Legal Defense Fund, NAACP, and others joined on board. So it came out of a sense of, I don't think many Americans and people around the world understand. George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, a black man jogging in Georgia, Breonna Taylor, all happened within 3 weeks. So it's like boom, boom, boom. I've been fighting these cases, both racial cases and police brutality cases, for decades. But never did we have such high profile things happen that close together. And that is what I think, given the pandemic, and given that everyone was under shutdown in most of the country, and there was no sports, so there was no distraction. The whole country was focused in on the news. People watching the news that don't ordinarily watch the news because they wanted to find out, when can I go back outside? And they're watching this tape of George Floyd with 8 minutes, 46 seconds. That's why in my eulogy, I told everybody, stand up wherever you are, stand up for 8 minutes and 46 seconds silent. And I can't tell you the amount of people that have said to me, wherever I've been, that I didn't really get it till you did that, because I stood up at home. They're watching me on TV. And after 2 minutes, I couldn't stand still anymore. How can you keep your knee pressed on a guy that long unless there's some real hatred there or venom there? I told Martin, I said, I don't know that the reason I went ahead and announced it, even though we had just preliminary talks, is I don't know if we'll get this moment again where the country's focused on this unfairness. We've always had some support, even some interracial support, but I don't know if this is a moment. And one thing I learned from Martin's mother, who, because of Martin, I got to work with closely, and other mentors. I was too young to know Dr. King, and I'm like a generation or almost generation, Martin and I, behind John Lewis and Jesse Jackson. What I learned from them is you got to seize the moment. And this was a moment to do two things. One, get the George Floyd Policing and Justice Act through the Senate. It's passed the Congress, which outlaws and makes a felony out of compression or chokehold, to make their a policeman's records public if he's had a litany of complaints, and to deal with their immunity. So we want that law. Secondly is the John Lewis voting rights law, which would replace Section 4 that was taken out by the Supreme Court. The objective of the '63 march was to deal with public accommodation, which led to the '64 Civil Rights Act. Our march is to hopefully lead to the Floyd Act and to the John Lewis Voting Act, and make them central in the presidential campaign. Now, without it ending in legislation, historians will say there was a summer of discontent after George Floyd. We wanted to say historically it led to the enactment of marching. That's why we're going to Washington. That's why we're bringing the families of all of these victims, bringing Breonna's family, bringing Ahmaud's family, bringing Rashad Brooks' family, all of them, about 17, 18 families, all the way back to Eric Garner's family and Trayvon Martin's family is coming. Because I want to stand those families in the shadows of Abe Lincoln, who 157 years ago signed the Emancipation Proclamation with a promise of full citizenship to Black Americans. 100 years later, Dr. King stood on those steps saying that you promised. That's why they didn't go to Jefferson's Memorial or the Washington Monument. They went to where the promise was made, Lincoln, and said, you promised, and the promise has not been fulfilled. We want to come 57 years later saying the promise is still not fulfilled. Yes, we got a Black president. Part of the promise has come true, but now they're trying to erode our right to vote, and we have an issue of policing. So we're doing that. Now, we had no idea that we'd still be in a pandemic. So we've told some of the people coming that are in hotspot areas, march in your area. So we're not looking for 100,000 people, but we're gonna have thousands there. And I don't care if no one's there, but the families and Martin and I, the point will be made because the Congress and this election ought to deal with law, not just deal with continual protest.
We've heard calls across the country to defund the police. What is your perspective on this, and should cities defund their police departments?
I think cities across the country ought to reinvest, reassign the fund. Defund the police gives the connotation, they're talking about taking away all money. It's like, why is there not money in community policing that works and having programs set up to deal with community policing and community cooperation? Mental health, dealing with ex-convict program. Why do you continue to pour money into things that have not proven to work? And I think that that is a better way of doing it. Another misnomer that I think a lot of the media miss is these were the same tensions in '63. Is you had those that had organic movements. Let's remember the Freedom Riders was not an organization. Martin Luther King never rode a bus with the Freedom Riders, NACP. That was students that on their own started doing that. And it later formed SNCC. The Greensboro Four, famous sitting at the lunch counter in Woolworths, they were not an organization. This was four students who decided they were going to integrate that lunch counter. At the same time, you had the NAACP, you had SCLC with Dr. King. So today, when we see organic movements jump up, we act like this is new. They always happen. And you have those that are critical of organic organization. You have those critical of civil rights leadership. Let's not forget, in '63, Malcolm X was condemning the March on Washington as the farce on Washington. But I think a lot of lazy journalists say, oh, there's differences now. There has always been differences. As long as there's energy out there, Martin Luther King used to say, you take the thesis and the antithesis and make it the synthesis. And that's what we're trying to do. So I think that the whole thing around defunding police, the way I synthesize it is, let's put the monies differently. But clearly, as we have a gun control problem, none of us are saying eradicate policing. It's how you do policing. 3 weeks after I did George Floyd's funeral, I preached the funeral of a 1-year-old kid killed by a stray bullet in Brooklyn. So we need policing, but proper policing.
The USPS has warned 46 states that it cannot guarantee that ballots cast by mail in November will arrive in time to be counted. What would you say to Americans who want to ensure that their voice is heard?
I think that they've got to go get absentee ballots. They've got to vote. One of the things I'm going to outline in my address at the march is we need tens of thousands of volunteers to be at the polling sites to help make sure people vote, to go get beverages if people have long lines and you can't, you get faint if it's in a hot area, to have chairs there for seniors. We have to do everything we can to make sure people vote in November. And even then, I expect from this president, there's going to be some challenges and there's going to be some issues, but we need to eradicate them more. I want us to walk out of Washington because we'll be online and all of that. We're building an army of people ready to do what is necessary to bring people out for early voting and voting on that day, and keep the pressure on now that the Congress has voted this $250 billion to the post office, keep the pressure on the Senate to pass that to make sure that the postal services can be ready. But I'm not going to depend on that. I want to do both and strategies, not one or.
Senator Kamala Harris accepted the candidacy for vice president last week at the Democratic National Convention. Some activists have been wary of Senator Harris's experience as California's Attorney General, particularly in the midst of this broader conversation about justice reform. If she is elected vice president, do you think her experience as a prosecutor will influence her response? And what immediate actions would you want her and her running mate, Joe Biden, to take?
What I've said, I was one of the first to come out, if not the first, to say to Joe Biden, both publicly and privately, that I wanted to see a Black woman as the vice presidential candidate. He had said he wanted a woman. I remember him and said it should be a Black woman, and I had him on my MSNBC show and said that way before most. I was glad he chose Kamala Harris. I think she's qualified. I think she'll do a good job. But I'm also concerned about, and they don't have to be Black, who's going to head the Justice Department. I think that the three areas that we've got to put pressure on Joe Biden if he's successful is the Justice Department, the AG, Secretary of Treasury, and Secretary of State. And I think that Kamala Harris as vice president can play a vital role in being in his ear around those areas, particularly the Justice Department, since her work has been in law. She has done things as Attorney General that some of us that call ourselves progressive may disagree. But she's also done some things that we agree. I can say that I've known her 10 or 15 years, and I can say that in the things that I've worked with her in the Senate, she's been on the right side of the issue. But that would be executed through the Justice Department and the AG's office. And I think that's where we would have to hopefully be able to work with Vice President, if she's successful, Harris, to institute. And among them would be the execution of the George Floyd law. The problem has been that this Attorney General and the Justice Department has not enforced laws that are already there about policing, and there are not enough there, but there are some. They withdrew consent decrees. One of the first things that happened when Trump came in is cities like Baltimore, Chicago, that had consent decrees because they had a pattern of police abuse. This administration withdrew them or began trying to. They withdrew lawsuits on voting. So you need a proactive Justice Department to pick up and catch up and then go further than the Justice Department under Barack Obama. So our work is not over on election day. If Joe Biden is elected, he knows better than anybody. I'll be the first right on his steps saying, okay, fine. Glad we got rid of the other guy, but here's what we need done. Who we doing here, who we doing there, which is why even in the Obama administration, I had, as well reported, access to the administration, but I never took a job, never wanted an assignment, didn't want to be an envoy nowhere, asked friends in the administration. I wanted to be free enough to get in the door and advocate. And that's what we're going to do under Joe Biden, big time, if he is successful.
Reverend Sharpton, I have one last question for you. You toured with the Queen of the Gospel, Mahalia Jackson, and her music and her voice defined and supported in so many ways the civil rights movement. Can you tell us, as we close today, if there is a song you've turned to in these times for strength or inspiration?
You know, it's funny you asked me that. No one has asked me that because it's a simple answer, because it's true. I used to tell Aretha when I was growing up, my father was a businessman. He left us when I was 10 and abandoned us. And not many years later, my mother used to play her gospel album. She made only one gospel album called Amazing Grace. And that song, Amazing Grace, written by a slave trader in the 1800s, but it was a historic song. Nobody sang it like Aretha. And I would come in my mother's kitchen, and she'd be with tears in eyes, scraping together a little food because we want welfare after Daddy left. Hearing Aretha sing Amazing Grace. And on my way to preach George Floyd's funeral, I took out my iPad and listened to Aretha singing Amazing Grace. And it was that song that helped me say, you know what? All of us have had that knee on our neck. And I just extemporaneously said that in the eulogy. But that was inspired by Aretha. If I'm looking for, because I'm not a manuscript speaker, if I'm looking for a vibe, I go to Amazing Grace by Aretha Franklin.
Well, Reverend Sharpton, thank you so much for your time today and for your work.
Thank you.
And Ashley, back to you.
Thank you, Mia and Reverend Al Sharpton, for that powerful conversation. Joining us now is the mayor of St. Paul, Minnesota, Melvin Carter. Thank you so much for joining us today, Mayor.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me on.
In a few days, thousands of people are going to descend on Washington, D.C. for a march. And it is not just to commemorate the 1963 March on Washington. It is also a demonstration against police brutality, of which we've seen myriad of in recent events. How are you feeling with these marches being 60 years apart, fighting the same fights?
You know, it speaks volumes, you know, as we think about the conversations that we're having literally today in America. as we think about calling for charges, as we think about saying that, you know, somebody should not have been treated the way they should have been treated, and somebody has to be held accountable. As we think about the historic toll of the relationship, in particular, between law enforcement and African American men. You know, we've seen a pretty devastating last decade in which we've seen these things play out on videotape. But we have to know that the only thing that's new is camera phones. That my father and his grandfather could tell you about this phenomenon. And unfortunately, it's going to continue moving. It's going to continue happening in our country until we get tired enough of it to make it stop.
What are some of the local issues that are playing out right now in the St. Paul community that you think are directly addressing or at least relevant to this national conversation around race and police brutality?
You know, this is a conversation that we've been having here in St. Paul for quite some time. And so we are having our conversations at the local level, same as we are nationally, about the level of funding of our police department. The dichotomy of policing is that we need officers. We need our officers to show up. We need them to know our neighborhoods. We need them to be invested in our future. We need them to help us solve our crises and help us out and through some of our most harrowing moments in community. And we need them to show up and not kneel on our necks, either figuratively or literally. And so that's the conversation that we've had in St. Paul. We've been fortunate to have a series of good chiefs, including our current chief, who are very focused on community-based relationships. We're fortunate to have a community who knows that our public safety framework has got to be bigger than just responding as quickly as possible after something bad has happened. That's emergency response, and it's important. And our public safety framework has got to include investments that can help us make it less likely that those bad things will happen in the first place. And so, you know, as the conversation has turned to this over the last few months nationally, we're proud in St. Paul that 3 years ago, we completely revised our use of force policies, that a couple of years ago, we completely revised the rules of engagement for our canine unit to ensure, to minimize bites and ensure that they are being used to locate and not to act as an apprehension tool. That we last year funded what we call our Community First Public Safety budget that invests in proactive public safety measures, community-based proactive public safety measures. And so we've been investing in all of these things, and we're going to continue to push down this road as a city because we're seeing nationally right now why that's so critical.
The recent shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin, has amplified conversations about race and police brutality in the United States. I also know that the Minneapolis City Council recently pledged to dismantle their local police department. What would that mean for St. Paul?
You know, I think in general, what we're seeing is an acknowledgement, a reckoning that this public safety framework that we've been promised for all of our lifetimes, for generations, that if we just hire more police officers, hire more tougher prosecutors, and build bigger prisons, that our communities will be safer. And every time we don't feel safe, we double down and triple down on that same logic. And frankly, it just hasn't worked. We still feel as though we're not safe enough. And you know, that old definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So I applaud everyone in our community and those in our country who are saying we need a fundamentally new approach. I think that approach has got to be balanced, it's got to be thoughtful, it's got to be systemic, and it's got to be strategic. And our banner in St. Paul is it's got to be evidence-based. So we're looking for evidence-based violence reduction strategies that we can employ and that we can actually evaluate over time to say, look, compared to whatever comparable cities or compared to whatever we'd expect based on statistical analysis, here's the difference that we're making in our community. For us, that's going to look like having first responders who, like I said, come from our community, who know our community, who reflect the diversity of our community, having them focused on violent crime and like proactive community outreach. Our St. Paul police officers do that really, really well. It's going to center around one of the next chapters for us is identifying and building a set of rapid responders to help us respond to some of those non-criminal, non-violent calls for service that come into our 911 call center. About 2/3 of our 911 calls in St. Paul are for our lowest priority calls. Those things that are, you know, barking dogs or loud parties or a car parked illegally or people who are just in crisis. So we want social workers, we want mental health providers, we want counselors, we want drug therapists and things like that. By the way, we hear that from our police officers all the time. They say, we can't just be police officers, we have to be all of these other things. And so we want to give them the opportunity to be police officers. The third phase is these kind of evidence-based violence reduction strategies, like Cure Violence, like GVI. There are lots of models around the country and around the world that have been pretty well proven to be effective in community. And then the final phase, which is really important, is you show me a child, or you show me a neighborhood, or you show me a block in any neighborhood in America that we're worried about, that we think is at real high risk for violence, and I'll show you a person or a place that has been underinvested. So our final piece is proactive public investments in those neighborhoods and individuals who we think of as our highest potential opportunities here to change something for our future, for our city's future. That's going to be the framework that we're moving forward with in St. Paul. I'm looking forward to showing the nation what we can do.
Now, you're a Black man, the child of a police officer, a former police officer, and a public official, all at the same time.
That's right.
How are you approaching these conversations about policing in your community to encourage, bridges instead of, necessarily burning it all down, even if some people think that's the right thing to do?
That's right. In some ways, I've been practicing this conversation all my life. Like you said, I grew up in the house with a former St. Paul police officer. My dad became a police officer after a lawsuit forced our city to integrate our police department. So he came on with a class of officers who were from our neighborhood, who knew our names, who were invested in our future. We'd go to fight night or the Super Bowl parties, and we'd see these officers in community solving problems in ways that were unique. They could help us solve them because they had that badge and because they had the tools of the uniform. But if they weren't from our neighborhood, they probably wouldn't even know that they were a problem in the first place. So we would see them as like superheroes in our community. And then I tell folks I turned 16 and I started meeting a whole lot of other police officers in our community. As I got pulled over for a whole slate of reasons we don't have time to discuss right now. And so seeing all of these things go together, being able to feel the horror of what happens when our badge is distorted, when the meaning of that badge is distorted, when the meaning of good policing is distorted, but then also being able to see and feel how it feels to have officers in our community who care for us, who are literally our caretakers and our peacekeepers in our community, are two truths that I've just had all of my life. I believe those truths can coexist, and that's the road we're charging down.
When you have to have these difficult conversations around race, around policing, around just all of the work that you do, that at times can seem controversial because you can't please everybody, does it help to be able to go to your group text of Black mayors and ask for support and advice and suggestions in those times?
Oh, it really helps. We've got a great cohort of mayors around the country who are passionate about these same issues. As Washington, D.C. kind of devolves into paralysis and partisan fighting, you just don't have that privilege as a mayor at the local level. And so you still got to push forward. You still got to do something. When none of the roads are ideal, you still have to kind of pick a direction and move forward. And so having the mayors across the country, from Michael Tubbs to Keisha Lance Bottoms to Steve Benjamin, to just all of them, we've got an incredible cohort of in particular, African-American mayors who we support each other, we trade ideas, we steal ideas from each other pretty aggressively, and we share resources because we're all invested in each other's success. And so, for example, this notion that I just talked about police officers kind of lightening the load for our officers so that they are not chasing these nonviolent, non-criminal calls all day long, that's something that San Francisco is doing, for example. And so my staff is on the phone with Mayor London Breed's staff. Mayor London Breed and I text back and forth, kind of talking and trading notes about how we do that, how we're approaching different types of problems. And it really helps us to find, I think, the path of least resistance for all of these things.
One of the things I know could happen is that St. Paul could become the next city to get a guaranteed income program and see how that goes and how that turns out. What do you think, or how do you think that could change the lives of your citizens?
I think citizens and non-citizens, I'll say. I think it could be really important. We need a new relationship between our neighbors and our economy. We know that. We knew that in 2019, but if we didn't, we better know that in 2020. We've seen in St. Paul, we're a city of 315,000 people, and we've seen over 70,000 applications for unemployment since March 15th. During that same time, our stock market has rebounded. Our stock market has come back. Our asset owning class has made significant returns. Real estate is changing hands. Lots of people are changing hands. And what I think has been demonstrated is this divorce between our stock market economy and our street level economy that's just not going to work. When my grandfather was growing up, when my father was growing up, and to some extent when I was growing up, the value proposition of businesses in our community was that in order to sell groceries, in order to sell books, in order to rent videos in our community, you had to employ people in our community. That's no longer the case, and we all know it. That's great for the businesses short term. That's great for those who want to kind of maximize a return short term. But at some point in time, unless we figure out a new way for people to participate with our economy, we'll run out of consumers, and that'll be bad for everybody. And so basic a guaranteed income is a concept that's been around for a very long time. I'm one of a cohort of mayors around the country that have formed this national organization called Mayors for a Guaranteed Income. And in doing so, we committed to both helping to advocate at the federal and state levels for a guaranteed income while providing a local pilot. So we are absolutely going down the road of a demonstration pilot right here in St. Paul, through which, like Stockton did ahead of us, we'd identify about 135 families, low-income families with children in our community who would receive an unconditional benefit of $500 a month for a period of 18 months. We would work with the national evaluator to evaluate the impact on our local economy, the impact on those families, the impact on the children, the impact on their spending. And I expect to find out, just like they did in Stockton, that when families have access to a little bit more money to spend, we see families who, I got a mentor who always says, find themselves with too much month at the end of their money, constantly over and over and over again. And when they have a little bit more money to make it through the end of the month, they spend it on food, they spend it on rent, they spend it on car repairs so they can get to work, and the same types of things you and I would. People look at this as though it's like this radical, incredible and unusual idea. The thing that's surprising to me, in a country that we declared a war on poverty how many years ago, we've spent billions of dollars every year on poverty, that we've literally tried everything except making sure that low-income families have money in their pocket. For that to be regarded as this fundamental, wild new idea in and of itself says volumes about our public ethic toward our most vulnerable residents.
I just want to ask you one more question.
Sure.
What's bringing you hope these days? Because I feel like it is not necessarily in short supply, but it is absolutely not in enough conversations. So where are you finding it?
Look, this might actually be my longest answer. When COVID shut down businesses, we saw people who didn't know how they were going to pay the rent on their restaurant, whose top priority was saying, how do we take this food and feed low-income families in our community? How do we feed children in our community? And we saw civil unrest damage or destroy over 300 businesses in our community in one night. We woke up the next morning to neighbors literally coming out of the woodworks with just shovels and brooms and rags and sponges to just help each other clean up. We saw businesses who still had their windows boarded turn their parking lot into a supply exchange so that families could swap groceries or diapers or formula or whatever they needed. I was standing outside one business that was completely destroyed, was burned to the ground. The business owner looked at me and said, "Mayor, I've lost everything." And I told her, "Yes, and we're gonna be here to help you rebuild." And she said, "No, I was just pointing out, I can help other people. If you're building an effort, I can be a part of this to help." So that's been really incredible to me. The way city employees and public employees around our country and around our community and right here in St. Paul have just stepped up to the plate, have redefined their jobs. We've had librarians sewing masks. We've had recreation center workers, delivering food, and on and on and on. The way our public employees have stepped up to serve our community has been incredibly inspiring. I can't walk through Target or around the lake in our community without somebody saying, how do I pitch in to help? That's inspiring. And I'll tell you, I've mentioned to you, I've got an incredible wife and some pretty amazing children at home. And when all else fails, I get to go home and they put everything into context.
I love that. Thank you so much, Mayor Carter, for your time.
Thank you.
Now, after the break, we have Congresswoman Karen Bass of California. So stay tuned.
The Our Home is the training ground for her dreams policy from American Family Insurance. Insure carefully. Dream fearlessly.
Welcome back to Time 100 Talks. Our last guest joining us today is Congresswoman Karen Bass of California. She'll be speaking with Time's Molly Ball. Molly?
Thanks, Ashley. I'm Molly Ball, and I am joined today by Congresswoman Karen Bass, Democrat from California and chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. Congresswoman Bass, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Once again, we have protesters in the streets calling for justice after a Black man was shot by police, in this case, Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin. What are your thoughts on what happened in that case?
Well, all I can do is just let out a big sigh, because since George Floyd, there have been several other people that have been killed under very dubious circumstances. I might say that on the same night as he was killed, there was another shooting in Louisiana where a man was shot in the back 11 times. He died. And so I think it just goes to show how important it is for us to pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And as you know, it passed with bipartisan support out of the House, and it has been languishing in the Senate, along with so many other bipartisan bills.
Do you have any hope that legislation can advance in this Congress?
I do have some hope, and that is because I know that Senator Tim Scott is interested in introducing a new bill, not the bill he originally introduced, but introducing a new bill. What that bill would entail, I don't know. That is an issue for the Senate to decide. But if they are able to pass a bill, then that way we would be able to go to conference and see if we can develop anything that would pass in both houses. But, it just goes to show how this is such an issue that is so raw. And I am always happy to see peaceful protests, because peaceful protest is the type of pressure that is needed to make Congress move. I am very concerned about protests that lead to violence and lead to looting, because all that does is just provide the Republicans an excuse not to move forward. And it's a campaign issue to campaign on the violence without recognizing that 99% of the protests have been absolutely peaceful.
Senator Scott was on the stage of the Republican convention saying that Democrats don't want to solve this problem. They want the issue to campaign on. Is that true?
No, that's not true at all. But, he was giving a speech, red meat at the convention, so I wouldn't expect anything different. But in my conversations with him, he certainly knows better. If the Democrats just wanted to grandstand on the issue, we would not have worked so hard in the House, and it would have not passed with every single Democrat voting for it. And that's no small measure, because I believe, frankly, that if the nation had not experienced the trauma of witnessing the murder of George Floyd over 8 minutes, then I don't know that a bill would have garnered 100% of Democratic support. So the fact that our members, especially our members that flipped seats, that were taking a courageous vote, why would they have voted for the bill then?
As you mentioned, the Republicans have pointed to the destruction and violence that have accompanied some of these protests to accuse Democrats of making American cities unsafe, and make the argument that electing more Democrats will lead to chaos. How do you respond to that argument?
Well, first of all, as I mentioned, I certainly hate to see the violence, but I'm going to raise a question that I'm not always so sure where this violence is coming from. because there have been several examples of people who were leading, instigating, committing the violence, who were actually from conservative groups that were intentionally trying to instigate chaos. And there was a tragic example in Northern California, in the city of Oakland, where during the protests, a man was murdered. An African-American man who was a federal police officer was murdered. And for a number of weeks, it was assumed that it was the protesters that were calling for reform that were responsible for the murder. However, it was revealed that it was a right-wing man who was white, who intentionally infiltrated the protesters so he could be near the protesters to make it look like they did the killing. And that was not the case. There was another example in Minneapolis where there was a white protester who disguised himself, and he was breaking windows, and it turned out he was from a right-wing group. So I don't automatically assume that the violence and the looting is identical to the people who were protesting. Now, in some cases it is, but it does not remove the fact that the overwhelming majority, people have been protesting now for months, and the overwhelming majority of these protests have been peaceful and helpful.
Well, as you say, people have been protesting for months. I mean, people have been protesting for years, if not decades. If you go back to the March on Washington, the anniversary of which is coming up this weekend. What do you say to those protesters who say, no matter how many times we speak up, nothing seems to change, the bill can't get through Congress? Why should they have hope when their government doesn't seem to be listening?
Well, let me just tell you that I've been one of those protesters for decades. You know, I started in being involved in this issue over 40 years ago. And from an African-American perspective, this has been an issue since we arrived here over 200 years ago. And so you always have to maintain hope. I actually can attest to the fact that things are better. Are things transformed? Are they radically different? Is it radically improved? No, but there has been change. And so it's the responsibility of people like me who've been involved in this issue for a long time and who are in elected office to communicate that and to encourage people that change is absolutely possible. I think that the Republicans very much would like for people to think that change is not possible, so that either you don't vote or you vote for Trump.
The Republican convention is underway right now. The Democratic convention took place last week. What do you think was the overarching message of that Democratic convention? And do you think it was convincing to swing voters in particular?
Well, first of all, it was wonderful to see a glass ceiling broken at the Democratic convention with the nomination of Kamala Harris as the vice president. I think that the overall message from last week was one of the American people, was one of hope, was one of we cannot move forward in a nation until we aggressively attack the pandemic, something that Trump should have done in March. I'm fearful that when President Biden takes over in January, that he's gonna have to hit a reset button. But I thought it was a beautiful convention of the stories of the American people. Now, I think what we're gonna see this week is this is a convention about one person and one person only. Well, one person and his family, and that's about it. It's kind of reminds me of the type of convention or ceremony that you would see under a dictatorship with an autocrat.
You mentioned the nomination of Kamala Harris. You yourself were a top contender in the so-called Veep stakes. Is there another position in the potential Biden-Harris administration that you're interested in?
You know what? I'm only focused on one thing. I think it's 70 days until the election. That is my focus. After that, then we'll see.
What worries you the most about the election when you think about the prospects for Democrats being able to win?
No question. What worries me about this election is voter suppression, and I'm ashamed to say that. You know, I work in foreign policy and travel the world, in particular in Africa, and preach to African nations about democracy and what a democracy we have here, and the right to vote should be guaranteed, and you should do everything you can so all of your citizens can participate. And here we are over here having to fight against a president who wants to do everything he can to suppress the vote and is pretty proud in saying so, as he spoke to a group of African Americans and said that one of the reasons why he got elected was because Black people didn't turn out to vote in the numbers that they should have. And so let's do everything we can this time around, including slowing the mail so the votes can't be counted, not allowing people to vote safely and from home. And we've had a couple of experiences where people show up to vote, they wait in very long lines, and they get sick. It's crazy that that happened in the richest country in the history of the world, period, that people have to wait any amount of time. We could make voting way easier and far more universal if we wanted to. And it's shameful that in 2020, 100 years after women have the right to vote, that we actually are still struggling for the right to vote, the ability to vote.
So how confident are you that this election will be conducted freely and fairly and will produce a result that we can all agree is legitimate?
Well, I am confident because I'm confident in the American people, and I am confident that organizing and activism can, I don't want to use the word Trump, but can overcome voter suppression. And that has happened in the past, and I believe it will happen again.
Do Democrats have a game plan for after the election if Donald Trump or anybody else refuses to accept the result?
Well, I think that as much as he has not paid attention to abiding by the law during his presidency, he will be compelled to abide by the law when he loses the election.
And how do you think that a potential Biden-Harris administration could work productively with Congress?
Well, we have to take the Senate. That's very clear. We have to solidify our majority in the House, which is solid. I'd like to see us expand it, but we absolutely have to take back the Senate. Otherwise, we know that President Biden will be we won't be able to govern, but governing will be extremely difficult.
And these are dark times in a lot of ways. So I want to close on a more optimistic note. Given everything that's going on, is there anything that gives you hope?
Absolutely, everything gives me hope. What gives me hope are the people of this country who are resilient, who will overcome this, who will change things. We will get back to a sense of normalcy when we change this administration. There is an awful lot of repair work that needs to be done because of the damage of this administration, but I am extremely hopeful because one of the things that has happened over the last 3 years is that Trump has been a catalyst for a wave of activism and participation that somebody like me, who has been a lifelong activist, always relishes the times when we're in these periods. Now, I don't relish the reason, but the fact that people are so active, the fact that there are more women in office now than that there have been since the beginning of this country, there's more people of color on every branch of government. He has been a catalyst for tremendous participation. And ironically, he did bring us together. Now, he brought us together in opposition to him, but if you think about it, people are working across issues and understand each other's issues in ways that they never have before. And so I think there's a lot to celebrate in this time period.
Congresswoman Bass, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Ashley?
Thank you so much, Molly, and Congresswoman Karen Bass. And thank you to all of today's Time contributors and guests. I also want to thank American Family Insurance for making today's program and important conversations possible. And finally, I want to thank you, our audience, for tuning in. You also make this possible. For more information on Time 100 Talks or to watch past or future episodes, all you have to do is check out time.com/Time100Talks. Make sure to check us out next Thursday at 1 p.m. for an all-new episode. We hope to see you then.